I was working in Springfield that year, 1962, doing clerical work at a government office downtown. As a young woman, it hadn't been easy to find steady work, so I was willing to leave my hometown of Chicago for the opportunity. I didn't have a car yet, so every other weekend, I'd take the Illinois Central up to Chicago to visit my sister, who still lived near Hyde Park with her husband. The train ride was long enough to relax, not quite long enough to get bored. I usually brought a paperback, sometimes just sat back and watched the flat land roll past the window. That particular trip was in early October. I remember it because the leaves were starting to turn, and I'd worn my brown coat for the first time that season. I boarded the train late Friday afternoon. It was busy but not full, and I ended up with a window seat across from a man who looked maybe 40. Suit, tie, briefcase. Nothing unusual at first glance, except he looked at me just a little too long when I sat down. Not smiling, not unfriendly either. Just watching. We rode in silence for the first 20 minutes or so. I had a book with me, a collection of short stories by Truman Capote, and tried to focus on that. But I could feel him glance over every so often. Eventually, he leaned forward and asked where I was headed. I told him Chicago, and he nodded like he already knew. Then he asked if I had family there. I hesitated, but answered, "My sister." He nodded again, slower this time. Then he smiled and said, "That's nice. I figured you weren't going home alone." I tried to turn back to my book, but the man kept talking, asking how old I was, what I did for work, whether I lived alone. Each question felt just a little off, like he was trying to pin down more than just casual details. I gave short answers, avoided eye contact, but he didn't seem to notice or care. When I didn't laugh at one of his comments, he leaned back and stared out the window for a while. I thought maybe that was the end of it. A few minutes later, he pulled something out of his briefcase, a small notebook, and flipped it open like he was checking a list. Then, without looking up, he said, "You ever feel like someone could just disappear on one of these trips? Like, get off at a stop no one knows about and never be seen again?" He said it calmly, like he was asking about the weather. I didn't answer. I was suddenly very aware of how empty our car had gotten as we moved farther north. I told him I was going to the restroom and walked toward the back of the car, even though I didn't need to go. I waited there until we pulled into the next small town station, Joliet, I think, and quickly moved 2 cars forward when we stopped. I didn't look back. When the train started again, I found a seat next to an older couple reading newspapers and stayed there the rest of the ride. I didn't see the man again until we reached Chicago. As we pulled into Union Station, I let the older couple disembark first, then stayed behind a bit, pretending to fumble with my coat and bag. I scanned the platform through the window, half expecting to see him waiting there, but there was no sign of him. I thought maybe he'd gotten off earlier or just moved to a different car. I waited until most of the crowd cleared before stepping off. That's when I saw him again, standing near a column watching the exits. He hadn't seen me yet, so I slipped into the flow of people and ducked into a gift shop near the station doors. I watched from behind a postcard rack as he scanned the crowd, eyes flicking over faces. He was still holding that notebook. I waited until he turned and walked in the opposite direction before I rushed out, caught a cab, and didn't stop glancing behind me until I was 2 blocks away. I never told anyone. I felt stupid, like maybe I'd overreacted. But I still remember that look on his face, like he already knew too much about me. A week later, I saw something in the newspaper, a small article buried in the inside pages. A man matching his description had been arrested for following a woman home from a train station just outside St. Louis. He had maps, addresses, and a list of names in his notebook. My stomach dropped when I read that part. I'll never know if my name was in there too. But sometimes I still think about how close I might have come to finding out. In 1962, we lived in a narrow two-story house just outside the Mission District in San Francisco. It wasn't fancy, but it had everything we needed. My wife, Margaret, our 4-year-old daughter, and me. I worked at a print shop down on 16th Street, and most evenings were spent quietly at home, either helping Margaret in the kitchen or listening to the Giants game on the radio. We didn't have a television yet, but I was thinking of getting one by Christmas. Life was simple, and I liked it that way. The first call came on a Tuesday night, just after 9. Margaret and I were in the living room. She was working on a puzzle with our daughter Emily, and I was reading the paper. The phone rang. We had a beige rotary phone in the hallway by the stairs, and I got up to answer it. On the other end, there was nothing but a faint sound, breathing. No words, just this slow, heavy breathing. I said hello a couple of times, but whoever it was didn't speak. Eventually, I hung up and told Margaret it was probably a wrong number. She didn't think much of it. Neither did I. But the calls didn't stop. Over the next few nights, they kept coming. Always late, always the same thing, just that breathing. Sometimes I'd hear a soft click when I answered, like they were picking up and listening for a while before making themselves known. I started letting it ring after the third night. But whoever it was, they were patient, and they kept calling. It happened again the next night. Around 9, just after I'd tucked Emily into bed and was finishing up the dishes, the phone rang. Same thing. No voice, just breathing. This time it was slower, almost exaggerated, like whoever it was wanted me to hear it clearly. I waited again, said hello twice, and finally hung up. I tried not to let it get to me. Maybe it was a prank, some neighborhood kid messing around. But there was something about the rhythm of that breathing that didn't feel like a joke. I didn't tell Margaret. She'd already been anxious lately, especially with the news always going on about crime and break-ins. I figured there was no point worrying her unless it escalated. Still, I stayed downstairs later than usual that night. I pretended to read the newspaper, but really, I just sat near the phone. Every little creak in the house made me glance toward the windows. Around midnight, I finally went to bed. The next day at work, I mentioned it offhand to a guy in the office. Not seriously, more like making conversation. He just shrugged and said phones act up all the time. But later that afternoon, when I came home, Margaret told me Emily had answered the phone while I was gone. She said a man was talking funny and wouldn't say who he was. Margaret brushed it off, thinking it was just a wrong number. But I could see Emily was shaken. She didn't want to talk about it. That's when it started to feel less like a prank and more like someone watching us. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house had me sitting up in bed, listening. Around 2 a.m., I got up and quietly checked every window and door again. I even looked in on Emily, who was still curled up under her pink blanket, unaware of any of it. Margaret stirred as I climbed back into bed, asking if it was over. I didn't know how to answer that. The next day, I called the phone company. They said they could try to trace the calls if it happened again, but that we'd need to stay on the line longer. I didn't like the sound of that. It felt like asking for trouble. That night, we unplugged the phone altogether, and I even nailed shut the window in Emily's room. I didn't tell Margaret why I did that, just said it was old and warped. We went a full week without another call, and life slowly started to feel normal again. Then one morning, while getting the paper from the porch, I noticed something stuck between the storm door and the frame. It was a small puzzle piece, one from the set Emily had lost a few weeks ago. We'd turned the house upside down looking for it. I held the piece in my hand for a long time, heart sinking, because I knew for a fact it hadn't been there the day before. I didn't tell Margaret, because I didn't want her to freak out. After that, the phone calls stopped, and we never found out who it was. In the weeks that followed, I kept noticing how Margaret flinched whenever the phone rang. I had a bad feeling too. We never spoke about the calls again, but I still wonder who was on the other end and what they wanted from us. I was teaching English at a small school just outside Bologna in 1962. It was a quiet job, and the town wasn't large. A couple of cafes, a bakery, a train station, and a schoolhouse hidden behind a row of sycamore trees. I'd moved there from Florence to take the position, and although I missed the energy of the city, there was something comforting about how slow everything felt. I rented a room above a retired couple's shop, and every morning I walked the same path to school, past the old fountain and the newsstand, where Miss Sophia sold cigarettes and newspapers. The classroom was on the second floor of the building, with large windows that faced a gravel path and the back lot where students parked their bikes. The kids were lively but respectful, and I quickly got used to the rhythm of the day. Lessons, a coffee during the break, and the occasional chat with the other teachers. One of them, Gabriele, had been there for over a decade. He knew everything about everyone, and he liked to sit in the teacher's lounge with his espresso and quietly narrate the gossip of the town. It was Gabriele who first pointed him out. "There's a man who comes here every day," he said one morning in late October. "He just stands at the fence and watches the building, doesn't say a word, never moves much." I thought he was exaggerating, maybe just bored. But that afternoon, while walking to the post office, I noticed him, tall, thin, wearing a brown coat that looked just a little too big on him. He wasn't looking at the students playing out front. He was looking up, directly at the window of my classroom. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was a parent or someone waiting for a relative. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I got when I looked at him. Something stiff about the way he stood, like he wasn't just watching, but studying. By the next week, he'd become part of the background. Every afternoon around 3, there he was again, just outside the fence, eyes on the same window. Some of the kids started noticing too. One of the girls, Emma, even asked me, "Is that man your friend?" I laughed it off, but it left a weird pit in my stomach. One day, I tried waving to him from the hallway window, just to see what he'd do. He didn't wave back. He didn't even flinch. He just kept staring. not blinking, not shifting, like he hadn't even noticed me. Gabriele and I talked about it again later, and he told me he'd asked the headmaster. But no one knew who the man was. He wasn't a parent, wasn't a local. No one had seen him anywhere in town except standing by the school. Then one Thursday afternoon, he wasn't there. I didn't realize it until later, after classes had ended. I'd been so used to spotting him that his absence was almost more noticeable. That night I went to sleep easily for the first time in days. But the next morning, as I unlocked the classroom, something was off. The window closest to my desk was slightly open, and I never left windows open overnight. On the floor just beneath it, there were faint scuff marks, like someone had stepped in from outside. I closed the window and tried to shake it off, but all morning I felt jumpy. Every time a student got up or the door creaked, I flinched. During recess, I went outside and walked the perimeter of the building, that stretch of fence where the man used to stand. It had a section where the bottom slats were loose. I bent down and noticed the grass was flattened, like someone had crawled under recently. I told Gabriele, and he insisted we tell the headmaster again. But when we checked the classroom together, the scuff marks were gone. I started to doubt myself. The next Monday, I arrived at school early to prepare for a lesson. I was the only one in the building, except for the headmaster. I unlocked the classroom, turned on the lights, and stopped. Someone had rearranged the chairs. They were in a circle, all facing inward. I hadn't done that. No one else had a key to my room. At the center of the circle, there was a small object. I walked closer and realized it was one of my students' notebooks, open to a page filled with scribbles. No words, just looping lines and shapes scratched in hard with a pencil. I took it straight to the headmaster, but he couldn't explain it either. He just told me to go home and rest. I didn't return the next day, or the one after that. A week later, I handed in my resignation. I never got an answer about who the man was, or how he got inside. Some of the other teachers whispered about him for a while, but eventually, people stopped talking about it. I moved away and started teaching in another part of the country, but every so often when I see someone standing too still near the school, I don't look for long. I'm too afraid I'll see that same face again, still watching.